She just wanted to tidy up the steps at her new house. But under the concrete, she found black cables going deep underground. Her husband thought it was old wiring. But what they led to turned out to be much scarier. Look what was hidden under their house. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are from. For the first time in years, the Wilson family felt as though their lives had finally taken root. The narrow apartments and rented duplexes of their past had been replaced by something they could call their own, a house with peeling white paint, a front porch that creaked underfoot, and a little patch of green that belonged only to them. It stood on the edge of a small town in Pennsylvania, surrounded by quiet streets where maples shaded cracked sidewalks and the neighbors still waved when you drove by. To most people, it was an old house that needed work. To David and Emily Wilson, it was a dream long deferred and at last fulfilled. They moved in late in spring, their car loaded with boxes, their children bursting with excitement. David was the practical one, a man in his late 30s, whose days at the insurance office had trained him to measure risk, to make sense of the world in neat, explainable terms. Emily, 34, carried a gentler energy. She was a teacher at the local elementary school, the kind of woman whose patience seemed endless, whose smile lingered even when exhaustion set in. Their children mirrored both sides of them. 10-year-old Sam, quiet and thoughtful, with a budding fascination for computers and comic books, and 7-year-old Lily, a ray of curiosity and laughter, who could not keep still for long. When they first unlocked the front door, the house greeted them with the smell of wood, paint, and dust, an aroma of age and history. The floors creaked beneath their feet. The walls bore faint outlines of picture frames long removed, and the kitchen window rattled softly in the wind. Yet none of it seemed like a flaw to Emily. To her, it was character. She imagined cozy mornings filled with the smell of pancakes, evenings reading on the porch swing, children's drawings taped to the refrigerator door. It was not just a house. It was a promise that all their years of saving, of sacrifice, had meant something. That first week was filled with the kind of simple joy that accompanies beginnings. David repaired a section of the fence, while Emily unpacked boxes and arranged her books on the shelves. Sam found a place in the yard perfect for a treehouse, and Lily claimed the attic as her castle. In the evenings, when the work was done, they sat on the porch drinking lemonade, watching the sun slip behind the trees. There was a peace to it, a rhythm that felt earned. And yet, beneath that calm, there was something else, something faint that Emily could not quite name. It began as a sense that the house listened. The silence between creaks felt too deliberate, too aware. She laughed at the thought, blaming her imagination. It was an old house, after all, and old houses made sounds. But sometimes, when she paused halfway down the stairs, she could swear she heard the faint hum of something electrical, like the soft purr of a refrigerator, but deeper, more distant, as though it came from within the walls themselves. She mentioned it once to David, who simply smiled and kissed her forehead. "You've been working too hard," he said. "We'll check it out later." The days stretched into weeks. The Wilsons began to feel at home. Emily started planting flowers along the walkway, marigolds and white lilies, her mother's favorites. David mowed the lawn every Saturday morning, humming to himself as Lily chased butterflies across the yard. On Sunday evenings, they invited neighbors over for coffee and pie. One of them, a gray-haired woman named Mrs. Carter, seemed particularly interested in the house. She peered around with a mix of nostalgia and something Emily couldn't quite define, unease, perhaps. "I remember when this place was built," Mrs. Carter said one afternoon. "Government contractors, I think. It used to be fenced off for a while. People said it was just storage, but She stopped herself, smiling as though she had said too much. Anyway, I'm glad to see a family here again. That night, as Emily washed the dishes, her mind wandered back to the old woman's words. The house didn't look like a government building, and yet the thought stuck with her. Why had it been fenced off? Why were there still small metal tags bolted near the basement door, each stamped with long numbers she had never bothered to read? She brushed it aside. Every home had its history, and hers, she decided, was finally beginning. Still, there were small things she couldn't ignore. The back steps, for instance. 3 cracked slabs of concrete that led from the kitchen door down to the yard bothered her every time she saw Lily jump from them 2 at a time. The cracks were widening, the surface uneven. David kept promising to fix them when he had the time, but weeks passed, and the steps remained the same. On a quiet Saturday morning, with David at work and the children visiting a friend, Emily decided she would handle it herself. She put on her gardening gloves and grabbed a hammer from the shed. The sky was clear, cicadas buzzing in the distance, and for once, she felt a kind of pride in doing something tangible, something her own hands could change. The first strike of the hammer sent a flake of concrete flying. Beneath the dust, she saw not the expected layer of dirt, but something dark and glossy. Frowning, she set the hammer aside and brushed the surface with her gloved fingers. It wasn't rock. It wasn't pipe, either. It was a thick black cable, smooth and pliable, running directly beneath the steps. She crouched closer, following the line with her eyes. It disappeared into the soil, vanishing under the house. Her first thought was that it must be part of the electrical wiring, old perhaps, from a previous system. But the more she looked, the less sense it made. The sheath had no labels, no sign of weathering, and it was far thicker than any power line she had ever seen. Something about it unsettled her. A voice broke her concentration. "Oh my goodness, are you doing renovations already?" Mrs. Carter stood by the fence, carrying a basket of apples. Emily straightened, wiping the dirt from her knees. "Just fixing the steps," she said. The older woman's eyes fell on the exposed cable. For a moment her expression changed, tightened. Then she forced a polite smile. "Ah, well, be careful digging too deep around here. The ground holds all sorts of surprises." She chuckled softly, but there was no warmth in it. After Mrs. Carter left, Emily stared at the cable again, feeling that same faint hum beneath her fingertips. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Just old wiring, maybe even a remnant of whatever system once powered the basement. But something about Mrs. Carter's reaction clung to her like a splinter. She filled the hole halfway, leaving the top of the cable visible, planning to ask David when he came home. That evening, over dinner, she mentioned it. David listened, nodded, and smiled. "I'll take a look tomorrow," he promised, his voice calm. Probably an old line for the porch lights. Don't worry about it. He was the kind of man who saw the world as solvable, explainable, and his certainty soothed her for a while. But later that night, when everyone was asleep, Emily awoke to a faint, flickering light coming from downstairs. She slipped out of bed, her heart beating fast, and crept to the hallway. From the bottom of the stairs, she saw the lamp in the living room turning on and off in slow, rhythmic intervals. There was no sound, no wind, nothing that could have caused it. She switched it off at the base, but the moment she turned away, the bulb glowed again, dim and trembling. For the first time since moving in, the house felt less like a home and more like a living thing, something breathing in the dark. The next morning she went to the basement. It was cooler there, the air damp and heavy. Dust floated in the single shaft of light that streamed through the small window near the ceiling. The walls were rough concrete, stained with time. Along the far corner ran a cluster of old pipes, and electrical conduits. Emily knelt, searching for anything that might connect to the cable outside, but saw nothing out of place. Still, as she stood there, she heard it again. That low hum, steady and quiet, coming from somewhere beneath her feet. She left the basement quickly, locking the door behind her, though she could not have said why. When David returned from work, she said nothing about it. He was tired, and she did not want to sound foolish. But as she prepared dinner, she caught her reflection in the kitchen window, the yard behind her, the half-dug earth where the cable lay exposed. And for a fleeting second, she thought she saw a flicker of movement in the glass, as if something below the ground had shifted. That night, she dreamed of roots made of metal, spreading beneath the house like veins, pulsing faintly with light. When she awoke, her heart was pounding, the dream already fading. But the feeling remained, a strange, insistent certainty that something inside their home was alive. The next morning, while David read the paper and the children played with their cereal, Emily found herself staring at the kitchen door that led to the steps. Sunlight spilled across the floor, warm and ordinary, but the thought of that black cable beneath it filled her with quiet dread. She turned to her husband. "You'll look at it today?" she asked softly. He glanced up from the paper, nodded with an easy smile, and said, "Of course." She knew he would forget. He always did. And outside, beneath the broken concrete and the soil still dark from yesterday's work, the black line waited in silence, humming softly to itself, as though it had been waiting for someone to find it. The next few days passed under a thin film of unease, like dust that no one could quite brush away. Emily tried to ignore it at first, convincing herself that the strange flickering light and the humming in the basement had reasonable explanations. Old wiring, faulty connections, nothing to be afraid of. Yet the memory of the black cable beneath the steps refused to fade, haunting her thoughts as she washed dishes, folded laundry, and taught lessons at school. The image of it, the sleek, rubbery surface gleaming faintly in the sun, had settled into her mind, like a question without an answer. One morning, while David and the children were gone, she stood by the kitchen door, staring out at the spot she had filled with soil. The ground there looked different now, darker than the rest, as though the earth had absorbed something it shouldn't have. The curiosity that had been simmering inside her hardened into resolve. She fetched a shovel from the shed, knelt by the steps, and began to dig again. The metal edge bit into the ground with dull, rhythmic thuds. Sweat gathered on her brow, though the air was still cool. When the shovel struck something solid, she dropped to her knees and brushed the dirt away. The black cable appeared again, smooth and unyielding, vanishing deeper into the earth. She followed it with her hands, tracing its path until she found another line running parallel, and then another, crossing it at an angle. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't a single wire left behind by an old contractor. It was a network, a design. She leaned closer and placed her palm against one of them. It was faintly warm. That warmth was impossible. No cable should carry power without a connection. And yet it did. Beneath her hand, she felt something almost like a pulse, steady and alive. When David returned from work that evening, she showed him what she had uncovered. He crouched beside her, his suit trousers brushing the dirt, and peered down into the small pit. "Looks like old wiring," he said after a moment, the same calm tone he always used when she worried. "Probably for an old lighting system, maybe even a security thing from whoever owned the house before." She told him about the warmth, about the vibration, but he only chuckled softly. "Honey, you've got a vivid imagination. I'll call someone to check it out, okay? An electrician. He'll figure it out." He kissed her forehead, stood, and brushed off his hands as if the conversation were finished. The electrician came the next afternoon. His name was Tom Griffin, a stooped man with a gray beard and eyes that seemed to weigh everything they looked at. He carried a heavy toolbox and spoke little as Emily led him around the house and showed him the area by the steps. He bent down, examined the cable, and frowned. "That's not standard," he said finally. "You're sure you found this under the concrete?" She nodded. "It's too thick for residential wiring. Looks more like something they'd use for industrial setups labs, maybe. Old communication lines. But these materials, I haven't seen them in years." He straightened slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. "I'd advise not touching it. Could still be live. And if it's live, you don't want to know what's powering it." "Can you disconnect it?" Emily asked. He hesitated, then shook his head. "It's not connected the way it should be. It's coming from somewhere under the house, probably tied into the foundation. You'd need a crew to dig it all up, and even then..." He trailed off, giving her a look that said more than his words. "I can recommend someone who deals with old surveillance wiring. Some companies used stuff like this for monitoring or testing. But my advice? Leave it alone. Some things are better undisturbed." After he left, Emily stood on the porch watching his truck disappear down the street. The air felt heavier somehow. The phrase he'd used, surveillance wiring, echoed in her mind, though she tried to dismiss it. This was an ordinary house. It had to be. That night, after dinner, the air inside the house seemed charged. The children had gone to bed, and David was reading on the couch. Emily washed the last of the dishes, her eyes flicking occasionally to the kitchen window, where the yard lay hidden in shadow. The wind had picked up, making the branches scrape lightly against the glass. When she turned off the faucet, she heard it again. The low hum, faint but distinct, coming from beneath the floor. She froze, her hand still wet, listening. It rose for a moment, then faded, like a breath drawn in and let out slowly. She glanced toward David, but he hadn't noticed. Later, as they climbed into bed, she tried to tell him. He listened, his brow furrowed. But when she finished, he smiled wearily. "Old pipes," he said. "Or the heater kicking in. This house is older than both of us combined. You know how these things go." She wanted to believe him, to laugh at herself for being foolish, but the warmth in his voice couldn't erase the cold unease creeping up her spine. The following morning, she woke early, unable to shake the restlessness that had followed her through the night. The house was quiet, sunlight slipping through the curtains in thin stripes. She made coffee, stood by the kitchen sink, and stared down at the floor as though she could see through it. Something was wrong here, something unseen, but deeply present. By mid-morning, she decided to check the basement again. The steps groaned beneath her feet as she descended. Dust motes drifted in the beam of light that filtered through the small window. The air was damp and smelled faintly metallic. She moved carefully, scanning the walls. Near the far corner, she found a patch of concrete, smoother than the rest, as though it had been redone more recently. She knelt, running her hand over it, and felt the faintest vibration beneath her palm. Behind that wall, something was alive. She fetched a flashlight from the shelf and began inspecting the space more closely. Along the ceiling, she noticed several small conduits running toward the far end of the basement. They vanished behind a wooden support beam. Curious, she leaned around it and found a gap. A narrow hole where one of the conduits disappeared straight into the foundation. The edges of the hole were darkened, almost burnt-looking. She shone the flashlight into it, but saw only darkness. That night, she couldn't eat. The image of that black gap lingered in her mind, open and silent. After David and the children went upstairs, she remained in the kitchen, staring at the ceiling. A faint buzz filled the air, like the sound of electricity passing through old lines. She looked up at the light fixture. The bulb flickered once, then steadied. For a long moment, she simply watched it, half expecting it to blink again. When it didn't, she laughed nervously under her breath and told herself to stop acting like a child. But when she switched the light off, she could have sworn she saw a faint red glow in the fixture, like a tiny eye slowly closing. The following day, she called Tom Griffin again, but the line went straight to voicemail. When he didn't return her call by evening, she felt a ripple of frustration and fear. She needed answers. David had promised to call another electrician, but when she asked, he said he hadn't had the time. "You're making this into something it's not," he told her gently. "Let's just leave it be." His voice was calm, but his patience was thinning. Emily didn't press him. Instead, she decided to look for answers herself. While cleaning that afternoon, she began inspecting the vents. The one in the hallway was easy to remove. She unscrewed the grate and shone a flashlight inside. At first, she saw only dust and cobwebs, but as she adjusted the light, something metallic caught her eye. Tucked against the side of the duct was a small circular object, no bigger than a coin. It gleamed faintly in the light. She reached in and touched it with the tip of her finger. The surface was cold and smooth, and when she nudged it, it shifted slightly, revealing a tiny glass center. A lens. Her hand shook as she withdrew it. The air felt suddenly too thick to breathe. She reattached the grate, climbed to her feet, and stood there for a long time, staring at the vent as though it might come alive. That evening, when David came home, she tried to bring it up again. He listened, sighed, and ran a hand through his hair. "Emily," he said softly, "it's probably part of an old security system. They used hidden cameras for that sort of thing back in the day. You know, before wireless stuff. It doesn't mean anyone's watching us now." His explanation made sense, but the words felt hollow. Later that night, after he had fallen asleep, she crept out of bed and went downstairs. The house was dark, the air still. She stood in the living room and turned slowly in place, her eyes adjusting to the shadows. The faint shapes of furniture loomed around her. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, somewhere above her, a floorboard creaked. She looked up. The sound came again, faint but deliberate, as though someone were walking across the second floor. She whispered David's name, but there was no answer. When she finally went upstairs, she found both children asleep and David snoring lightly beside them. Yet the sound of footsteps lingered in her ears long after. The next morning, as she prepared breakfast, the radio on the counter came alive without warning. It wasn't tuned to any station, just static, crackling softly. She reached out to switch it off, but as her hand hovered over the dial, the static shifted. For a second, no more than that, she thought she heard a whisper beneath the noise, a child's voice, saying something she couldn't quite make out. Then it was gone. The radio was silent again. She turned it off and unplugged it, her heart pounding. When David came downstairs, she said nothing. He would think she was imagining things. Maybe she was. But that afternoon, as she stood in the yard watching the children play, she noticed something else. The grass near the old steps had changed color, darker than before, as though nourished by something unseen beneath the soil. She knelt and touched it. The earth was soft, too soft, and the faint hum returned, vibrating through her fingertips. That night, lying awake beside her husband, she stared into the darkness and tried to piece together what it all meant. The cables, the warmth, the hidden lens, the whispers in the static. Each detail alone could be explained away, but together they formed a pattern she couldn't ignore. The thought of that black network running under their feet filled her with both dread and a strange fascination. She felt as though the house itself were alive, its walls breathing, its veins pulsing with an invisible current. She promised herself she wouldn't dig again. She would wait, let David handle it, trust his logic. But as dawn crept through the curtains and the hum beneath the floor seemed to stir once more, she knew that promise wouldn't last. The mystery was no longer outside of her. It had seeped into her, winding its way through her thoughts like the cables through the ground. Whatever the house was hiding, it wanted to be found. By the time morning came, Emily's resolve had hardened into something close to obsession. She no longer told herself it was curiosity. She knew now that it was something deeper, a pull she could neither name nor resist. The sound that seemed to hum from beneath the basement floor had returned stronger than before, and the vibrations she'd felt through the earth near the steps still echoed in her memory like a phantom heartbeat. David had grown tired of her insistence that the house was hiding something, and she had stopped trying to convince him. There was only one way to know for sure what lay under their feet, and she intended to find it. The house was quiet that morning. David had left early for work, and the children were at school. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, falling across the spot where the radio had come to life the day before. She stood there for a long while, listening to the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall, before she finally opened the basement door. A rush of cool, damp air met her as she descended. Dust drifted in lazy spirals through the light, settling on the shelves that lined the walls. The basement smelled of earth and old metal. Somewhere behind the far wall, the faint hum persisted, steady and low, like something breathing in its sleep. Emily set down her coffee mug on a wooden crate and began clearing the space near the smoother patch of concrete she'd found days earlier. A few stored boxes, a broken chair, and an old trunk stood in her way. She pushed them aside, brushing her hands on her jeans, and stared at the wall. The memory of the electrician's warning whispered at the back of her mind, but it only fueled her determination. She fetched a hammer and chisel from the shelf, knelt, and struck the concrete. The first blow rang out sharply, echoing through the basement. She paused, her breath catching. Nothing moved but the dust. She struck again, harder this time. A small piece of plaster cracked and fell away, revealing a dull metallic sheen beneath. Her pulse quickened. She worked faster, the sound of her hammer filling the space. Bit by bit, the wall began to crumble, and within minutes, she uncovered what looked like a metal panel, smooth and cold to the touch. She ran her fingers along the edges and found a narrow seam running around it. A hidden door. She tried to pry it open with her fingers, but it wouldn't budge. She reached for the crowbar that leaned against the wall and wedged it into the seam, pressing with all her strength. The panel groaned, resisted, then suddenly gave way, swinging open with a squeal that made her flinch. Behind it lay darkness. A draft of cold air escaped, carrying the scent of damp stone and something faintly chemical. Emily hesitated for only a moment before grabbing a flashlight from the workbench and shining it into the opening. A narrow metal ladder descended into the gloom, vanishing after a few rungs. Her throat tightened. She glanced back toward the basement stairs, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the shadows remained still. The silence pressed against her ears. She took a deep breath, set the flashlight between her teeth, and began to climb down. The metal was cold beneath her hands. Each step creaked faintly as she descended, the light from above shrinking until it was little more than a pale square high above her. When her feet touched the ground, she turned slowly, sweeping the flashlight across the space. The beam caught on concrete walls, rough and damp, enclosing a small chamber barely larger than a pantry. Pipes ran along the ceiling, their surfaces slick with condensation. And in the center of the room, resting on a raised metal platform, was a rectangular box the size of a trunk, its surface flecked with rust. For a long time, Emily could only stare. The cables she had seen outside, the same thick black cords, were everywhere. They ran across the ceiling and walls, converging on the box like veins feeding into a heart. The flashlight trembled in her hand as she stepped closer. A faint vibration seemed to hum through the air, rising from the machine itself. The closer she came, the stronger it felt, until her own heartbeat seemed to synchronize with it. She crouched beside it, shining the light along its surface. The metal was dented in places but intact. Near the base, she noticed a small rectangular panel with tiny green lights, blinking in slow succession. She swallowed hard. The system was alive. Against her better judgment, she reached out and touched the surface. It was warm. The warmth startled her so much that she stumbled back, the flashlight beam dancing across the walls. She stood there, chest heaving, staring at the machine as though it might move, but it remained still, humming quietly to itself. Gathering her courage, she stepped forward again. The blinking lights continued, steady and rhythmic. She followed their pattern with her eyes until she found a small circular indentation above them, some kind of port or lens. When she shone her flashlight directly on it, something flickered to life. A dim screen embedded in the metal came alive, its surface flickering with static before resolving into a grainy image. Emily froze. The picture on the screen was unmistakable. It showed the kitchen upstairs, her kitchen. The angle was from high above, near the ceiling corner, and she could see the table, the chairs, even the mug she'd left behind. For a few seconds, she could only stare, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. Then she saw movement, a figure stepping into the frame, herself. Her stomach dropped. She backed away, the light shaking wildly in her hand. She turned toward the ladder, but her knees nearly gave out. For a moment she thought she would faint. Somehow, somewhere in this house, cameras were still working, transmitting images directly into this hidden chamber beneath her feet. She climbed the ladder as fast as she could, the rungs biting into her palms. When she burst into the basement, she slammed the panel shut and stumbled backward, gasping for breath. She sat on the cold floor for several minutes, trying to calm the racing of her heart. The flashlight lay beside her, its beam trembling against the wall. Her mind replayed the image over and over, the grainy footage, the faint glow of the lights, the unmistakable view of her own kitchen. When David came home that evening, she told him everything. The words tumbled out in a rush, her voice breaking as she described the hidden chamber, the cables, the blinking lights, the screen showing their home. He listened in silence, his brow furrowed, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and concern. When she finished, he exhaled slowly and rubbed his temples. "You're sure about what you saw?" "David, I'm not crazy. It's down there. It's been recording us. You have to see it." He hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Show me." Together they went down to the basement. Emily's hands shook as she pulled open the panel. The metallic creak seemed louder than before. She turned to him, her eyes pleading. "There," she whispered. "It's just down there." David stared into the opening, then climbed down the ladder. She followed, clutching the flashlight. The air in the chamber was colder now. The machine stood silent, the lights still blinking softly in the dark. David crouched beside it, running his hand along the metal. "You weren't kidding," he murmured. This is real." He pressed his palm against the surface, feeling the vibration. It still powered, but from where? He studied the cables as they disappeared into the walls, then turned to her. "You said the screen came on?" "Yes." It showed the kitchen, like a live feed. He frowned, searching for a switch or button. "There's nothing here now." He waited a moment, then straightened. Maybe some kind of old security system. Could have been part of the original design. Maybe whoever owned this house before us never disconnected it properly. His calm tone did nothing to ease her fear. It's watching us, David. It's been watching us. He sighed, brushing dust from his hands. Emily, we don't know that. It could just be looping old footage, or maybe it's broken. We'll figure it out. Tomorrow I'll call the police or someone from the power company. Right now, we just need to breathe. But that night, David didn't sleep. She could feel him lying awake beside her, motionless in the dark. When she turned toward him, his eyes were open. Neither spoke. Somewhere beneath them, the machine continued to hum. The next morning, Emily found the basement door slightly ajar. She was certain she had locked it the night before. The sight of it sent a cold shiver through her. She checked the panel. It was still closed, the metal undisturbed, but she could not shake the sense that something had shifted in the house. The hum seemed louder now, the floor faintly trembling beneath her feet. The children began to notice things too. Sam mentioned hearing noises at night, faint thuds from below, like someone walking slowly through the basement. Lily said the walls made funny sounds, like whispers. David tried to reassure them, telling them it was just the house settling. But Emily saw the flicker of unease in his eyes. Days passed with no word from the electrician. Emily began to search through the house, hoping to find some record of its past. In a forgotten cupboard in the upstairs hallway, behind a stack of old magazines, she found a dusty cardboard box filled with papers. Most were yellowed deeds and repair receipts, but at the bottom was a folder labeled Apex Systems. Her breath caught. She carried it to the kitchen table and opened it carefully. Inside were architectural blueprints of the house, stamped with the words, Project 47, Residential Observation Program. The plans showed every room, every wall, and running through them were dozens of fine lines marked, data conduits, the same cables she had found beneath the steps. At the bottom of one page was a signature, Harold G. Miller, Chief Engineer. She recognized the name from the neighborhood records. He'd once lived next door. David arrived home just as she finished reading. She handed him the folder silently. He flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing deeper with every line. Observation program? He said finally. What does that even mean? It means someone built this house to watch whoever lived here. It means this was never just a home. He closed the folder and set it aside, his expression hardening. Enough. We'll call the police. Tonight. But as darkness fell, the electricity flickered, and the hum beneath the house grew louder. When David reached for the phone, the line was dead. Emily stood by the window, staring out at the yard. The grass near the steps shimmered faintly under the moonlight, and for a moment she thought she saw it move, as though something beneath the surface were shifting, breathing. They waited until morning before calling again. The phone worked perfectly then, the hum gone, the light steady. David laughed nervously, saying it must have been a power surge. Emily said nothing. She knew better. Whatever lived under their house had not stopped. It had only gone quiet for a while, listening. The morning after the power failure dawned pale and colorless, as if the sunlight itself was reluctant to touch the house. Emily stood at the kitchen window, with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, staring out at the yard. The grass near the steps glistened with dew, dark and wet, but it no longer looked like grass. It seemed bruised, as though something beneath the soil had pressed upward in the night. She could still feel the hum from below the floorboards, faint but constant, like the steady breathing of something vast and unseen. The police were supposed to arrive that morning. David had made the call as soon as the line came back. They were coming to check the premises, to examine the basement, to confirm that the machine she had described really existed. Emily doubted they would find anything they could understand. When the two officers arrived, both young, both polite to the point of detachment, they asked questions that sounded routine. How long had they lived here? When had they first noticed something unusual? Was there any sign of forced entry? They wrote everything down in small, neat letters, nodding, making sympathetic noises, their faces never changing. Then they went down to the basement. Emily waited at the top of the stairs, listening to their footsteps echo below. After a few minutes, one of them called out, "Ma'am, could you come down here, please?" Her heart sank as she descended. The panel in the wall stood open, the ladder exposed. One of the officers held a flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness below. "Is this where you said the equipment was?" he asked. She nodded. "It's down there, just under the floor. You can't miss it." He glanced at his partner and climbed down first. Emily waited, her pulse pounding in her throat. Then came his voice again, quieter this time. "There's nothing here, ma'am. Just dirt and some broken pipes." She didn't believe him until she saw it herself. The ladder ended in a shallow pit, no bigger than a crawl space, filled with rubble and bits of broken concrete. The box was gone. The cables, the blinking lights, everything had vanished. The walls were scarred where the wires had been, but the metal had been stripped clean. She stared, speechless, her mind struggling to make sense of it. "It was here," she whispered. "You have to believe me. It was right here." The officer's expression softened, but only slightly. "Maybe someone came in through the night. You said the door was unlocked before?" He was trying to sound kind, but his tone carried the quiet condescension reserved for people whose stories didn't add up. David arrived home early from work and found her sitting on the porch, her hands trembling. He spoke to the officers, listened, nodded, promised to call if they discovered anything else. When they left, he sat beside her. For a long time, neither spoke. The street was empty, the air still. Finally, he said, "It's gone, Emily. Whatever it was, it's gone. Maybe that's for the best." She looked at him, her eyes hollow. "It's not gone," she said. "It's hiding." That night, she lay awake listening. Every sound in the house felt amplified, the creak of the rafters, the distant tick of the clock, the soft rustle of the curtains. She had almost convinced herself that the hum was gone when she heard it again, faint but unmistakable, rising from somewhere deep below. She sat up, her breath caught. The children were asleep. David's breathing was steady beside her. Slowly she climbed out of bed and went to the window. Outside, parked across the street, was a van she hadn't noticed before. A gray, unmarked vehicle with tinted windows. No lights, no movement. It had not been there during the day. By morning, the van was still there. David laughed when she pointed it out. "It's probably just a contractor," he said. "Someone working nearby." But he didn't meet her eyes when he said it. He left for work soon after, and the van stayed all day. Around noon, she saw the curtain in its side window flutter slightly, as though someone inside had moved. The police called later to say they were closing the case. "We found no evidence of tampering," the voice on the phone said. "No unauthorized electrical installations, nothing to indicate surveillance equipment." Emily thanked them quietly and hung up. She knew they would never come back. That evening, as the sun set behind the trees, the lights in the house began to flicker again. David was in the living room reading the paper when it happened. He looked up, irritated. "I thought they fixed the power lines last year," he said, shaking his head. Emily didn't answer. The flickering was steady this time, almost rhythmic. Then the television clicked on by itself. The screen glowed gray, then white, then showed a static-filled image of their own living room, an exact mirror of where they sat. She dropped the glass she was holding, It shattered on the floor. David jumped up, grabbed the remote, and switched the television off. But before the image disappeared, she saw something move in the corner of the screen, something that wasn't in the room. They spent that night at a motel. The children thought it was an adventure, but Emily could not shake the feeling of being watched even there. David promised to take another day off work, to call a professional security company, to have the house inspected top to bottom. He was doing his best to sound calm, but the exhaustion in his voice betrayed him. When they returned the next morning, the house looked the same, quiet, undisturbed. Yet as Emily stepped inside, she felt it immediately. The hum had returned, stronger than before. The security team came in pairs, carrying scanners and tools. They searched the attic, the basement, the walls. They found nothing unusual. "It's clean," one of them said, handing David a clipboard. "No hidden transmitters, no active lines. Old wiring, yes, but nothing that works." They packed their equipment and left, their polite smiles no different from the police officers. David seemed relieved. Emily felt like screaming. That night, the light stayed steady, the appliances silent. For the first time in weeks, the house seemed peaceful. They put the children to bed and sat together on the porch, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. "Maybe we've been letting this house get under our skin," David said softly. "Maybe it's just an old place with bad wiring. We'll fix it up, make it ours again." His words were gentle, almost pleading. Emily nodded, though she didn't believe them. She wanted to, but the quiet felt too deliberate, too heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Just after midnight, she woke to the sound of the floor creaking. At first she thought it was David, but his side of the bed was empty. She slipped out from under the covers and stepped into the hallway. The light from the night lamp cast a faint glow down the stairs. The creaking came again, from below. She descended slowly, her heart hammering. The living room was dark, except for a faint green shimmer that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. She followed it, every step careful, until she reached the door to the basement. It stood open. The glow was brighter now, pulsing softly. She whispered David's name, but there was no answer. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw that the panel in the wall had been torn open. The air was colder than before, sharp and metallic. The green light spilled from the opening, illuminating the concrete floor. She could see movement inside, cables twitching like snakes disturbed from sleep. She stepped closer, unable to stop herself. The hum had deepened into a slow, steady throb. "David?" Her voice trembled, echoing off the walls. There was no response, only the low mechanical heartbeat and the faint hiss of static. Then she saw the screen. It was back, embedded in the metal box that had returned to its place as if it had never been removed. Across its flickering surface, she saw the living room upstairs, empty, except for the faint outline of a man standing by the window. The image was grainy, but she recognized him immediately. David. He was staring out toward the street where the gray van had been parked, his face pale in the glow. Emily turned toward the stairs, ready to call out, but the sound died in her throat. Behind her, the screen changed. The image shifted to the basement itself, to the spot where she stood. The camera's view trembled slightly, focusing on her face. Her own image stared back at her, eyes wide with fear. The hum grew louder. Something moved in the shadows beyond the box. She took a step back, but the cables coiled tighter against the walls, sliding toward her like veins pulsing with life. She stumbled and fell, the flashlight clattering to the floor. When she looked up, the screen went black, then flickered once more, this time showing a single line of text. "Recording active." She ran, up the ladder, through the basement, into the kitchen, The lights in the house were strobing wildly now, every bulb flashing in sync with the sound of that mechanical heartbeat. She called for David, but there was no answer. The hum was everywhere, shaking the windows, filling her head. She burst into the living room and found the television on again, the same gray static rolling across the screen. Then the picture steadied. It showed the outside of their house, the front porch, the windows glowing from within. And in the lower corner of the screen, in small white letters, were the words, "Wilson Residence, session complete." The next morning, the street was crowded with police cars and reporters. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze. Neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns, whispering. Emily sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a blanket, her children clinging to her sides. David stood a few feet away, speaking to an officer, his face drawn, his hands shaking. The reporters shouted questions that no one answered. Inside the house, the basement was empty again. No machine, no cables, no sign that anything had ever been there. The only trace left behind was the faint smell of ozone and a patch of scorched concrete. By afternoon, the family was gone. They packed what they could and drove away, leaving the house to the silence that reclaimed it. From across the street, in the upper window of the empty house opposite, a camera lens glinted briefly in the sunlight. Deep in some dark room far away, a monitor flickered to life. On its surface appeared the image of the Wilsons' car disappearing down the road. Below it, in the same white lettering as before, a new line appeared. New session initialized. Subjects relocated. Observation continues. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story. Watch our other videos waiting for you right here on the channel. And if this one kept you watching till the end, share it with someone. Let them experience the twist for themselves.